It began, as so many stories of small consequence do, in the quiet hours of a winter morning, when the snow had not yet decided whether to fall or melt. The town of Amherst, Massachusetts, lay half asleep beneath a thin veil of frost. It was 1904. The air carried a tang of wood smoke and horse leather, and the world moved with the unhurried dignity of a nation not yet electrified by speed. On Main Street, beside the post office and across from the cobbler's shop, stood the Amherst Town Library, a red brick building with arched windows and an oak door whose handle had been worn to a soft sheen by decades of faithful hands. Inside, the air was a kingdom of silence, the kind of silence that could be heard, that seemed to listen back. At precisely 8 o'clock, the librarian, Miss Eleanor Whitcombe, unlocked the door as she had done every morning since 1891. She was a woman of quiet grace and formidable memory, the kind who could recall not only every title in her collection, but every borrower who had ever crossed her threshold. Her hair was the color of parchment, and her spectacles rested always at the tip of her nose, ready to catch any act of literary negligence before it happened. That morning she began as usual, opening shutters, straightening periodicals, and placing the return ledger on her desk. A pale beam of sunlight wandered across the shelves, touching the spines of Emerson, Hawthorne, and Longfellow, those familiar old sentinels of New England thought. The clock ticked softly. The world, it seemed, had chosen peace for another hour. It was then that she noticed it. A letter slipped under the door. Its paper was yellowed, the handwriting neat but trembling. She lifted it gently, as though it were an artifact. Inside, written in fountain ink, was a confession of sorts. Dear Miss Whitcombe, many years ago, when I was but a boy, I borrowed a book from your library, Essays in English Traits by Mr. Emerson. I regret to say I never returned it. I found it today, quite by accident, among my late father's belongings. It seems almost cruelly ironic that a book about honesty and character should have been the cause of my own small deceit. I wish to make it right. Enclosed is 15 cents. The fine, as I recall, was 1 cent per day. Yours in apology, Henry Forster, formerly of Amherst. Eleanor paused, the letter trembling slightly in her hand. She could not recall the name immediately, though she knew the Forsters, an old family, one of the town's earliest settlers. 15 cents, she smiled faintly. By modern standards, a pittance. By moral ones, a fortune. She held the envelope to the light. Indeed, inside was a single worn dime and a nickel, polished by use, the kind of coins that had passed through countless honest palms. 15 cents, she murmured half to herself, and 23 years late. She placed the letter upon her desk, her heart unexpectedly warmed. There was, she thought, a beauty in such gestures, the small redemptions of ordinary people. She did not know that this simple envelope would within weeks make its way into newspapers across Massachusetts, then New York, and eventually become known as the 15-cent debt, a story retold in parlor rooms and college halls alike, a reminder that conscience could still reach across decades. But the story, as every true story must, began long before its ending. In the summer of 1881, when Amherst was all meadows and quiet streets, young Henry Forster was 12 years old. His father, Samuel Forster, was a schoolmaster, the kind of man who carried his authority in the tilt of his hat and the tone of his silence. Their house stood on Elm Street, shaded by 2 maples that blazed red in autumn like twin torches. Books filled every room. Latin grammars, histories of New England, sermons of Jonathan Edwards. To Henry, the house itself felt like a library that had decided to grow walls and windows. It was on a Wednesday that his teacher, Miss Fairchild, announced that the class would visit the town library. Henry had never been. He remembered standing before those tall shelves for the first time, rows upon rows of leather-bound volumes, their spines stamped in gold. The smell of paper and polish filled him with awe. To a boy who had never traveled beyond the next county, it felt like a voyage across the world. Miss Whitcombe, then a young librarian of 30, had smiled at him when he asked for Emerson's essays. "You are a thoughtful boy," she said, "but you must return it in 2 weeks' time, Mr. Forster." He nodded solemnly. He took the book home and read it by lamplight. The words puzzled and stirred him. Emerson wrote of self-reliance, of the moral duty of the soul, of the courage to stand alone in truth. He underlined passages, though he knew it was forbidden. He carried the book to the fields, read it beneath the maple, and dreamed of a life larger than Amherst. But the weeks slipped by, and when the time came to return it, the book was nowhere to be found. He searched his room, his father's study, the barn. Nothing. Fear gnawed at him. Miss Whitcomb's rules were known to all. Late returns incurred a fine of 1 cent per day. To a boy with only nickels in his pocket, it might as well have been a ransom. So he did what children often do. He said nothing. Days became weeks. He borrowed other books, but never that one again. Then one day, the Forster family moved to Boston. The book, forgotten in some trunk or attic, went with them. Years passed. The century turned. Railroads multiplied, telegrams hummed through the air, and Henry grew into a man. He studied engineering, worked on bridges across the Connecticut River, married a quiet woman from Lowell, and buried his father in 1903. It was while sorting through his father's study, a chamber of dust and memory, that he found it. There, beneath a stack of papers, lay the small brown volume, Essays and English Traits. He recognized it instantly, as one recognizes a scar from childhood. The cover was worn, the library label still affixed. He opened it, and inside, in the familiar firm handwriting of Miss Whitcombe, was the date of lending, May 4th, 1881. He sat for a long while holding it. He could almost smell the summers of his youth, ink, wood smoke, lilac. Then came the shame, slow and deep. He remembered Emerson's words, "The soul becomes," and he realized that one could not truly become without making peace with the past. So he wrote the letter. When Eleanor received it, she brought it to the town clerk that very afternoon. Mr. Alcott, a portly man with a genial face, laughed heartily when she told him. 23 years late, you say? Well, Miss Whitcombe, that may be a record." "I rather think it is," she said primly, "but what matters more is the principle." "Indeed," said Alcott, pocketing his spectacles. "Would you mind if I mention this in the Gazette? The people love a moral anecdote." "I see no harm," she said, "but let it not make a mockery of Mr. Forster. He has done what few men would." By the following Thursday, the Amherst Gazette carried a small column on page 4, "Returned at last, a book 23 years overdue." Within days it was reprinted by the Boston Evening Transcript and the New York Herald. Letters began arriving at the library from as far as Chicago, readers expressing admiration, amusement, or philosophical reflection. Some confessed their own literary lapses. One woman from Ohio sent $1, declaring it "interest upon my own guilty conscience." She kept them all, bundled in ribbon. For Henry, the response came unexpectedly. One evening, as he sat reading at home, a knock sounded on the door. A Western Union messenger handed him a telegram. From Amherst Library, stop. Your letter received with gratitude, stop. Your honesty has become a story of good repute, stop. Your 15 cents paid in full, stop. E. Whitcombe. He read it twice, smiled faintly, and placed it atop the old Emerson volume. He had not sought recognition. Indeed, he felt almost embarrassed by it. Yet something in him felt restored, as though the boy he once was had finally exhaled.
But life has its echoes, and stories, once told, take on lives of their own. By spring of 1905, visitors to Amherst began asking to see the famous letter. Children on school tours giggled at the idea of a find so small, yet so enduring. Miss Whitcombe, dignified as ever, would display the envelope beneath a pane of glass beside the circulation desk. This, she would say, is proof that time does not erase integrity, it only delays its confession. One afternoon that April, as she was closing the library, she looked up to see a tall man standing quietly by the doorway. His hair was graying at the temples, his coat travel-worn. "Miss Whitcombe?" he asked softly. She turned, startled, and then her eyes widened. "Mr. Forster!" He inclined his head. "I hope I do not intrude." "Not at all," she said. "You have come far." "I had business in Springfield," he said, "and thought I might see the library once more. I am told my old crime is now a public exhibit." Eleanor smiled. "We prefer to call it an act of moral rectitude." He laughed, a warm, weary sound. "It seems a strange fame, to be remembered for 15 cents. "History records stranger things," she said. "Would you like to see the book?" She led him to a small glass cabinet. There, beside the letter, lay the old Emerson volume, carefully restored. He stared at it for a long moment. His reflection in the glass seemed to merge with that of his younger self, the boy who had read those words beneath the maple tree. "I suppose it has come home," he murmured. "Yes, as have you." Outside, the afternoon light slanted golden through the maples. Dust motes drifted like tiny ghosts between the shelves. And in that moment, with the faint ticking of the clock and the distant clip of hooves on cobblestones, time itself seemed to hold its breath, as if acknowledging the small miracle of a debt repaid, not in money, but in memory. The train whistle echoed across the valley as Henry Forster left Amherst that evening, bound for Boston once more. The town shrank behind him, its steeples and rooftops dissolving into the dusk. He leaned against the carriage window and watched the faint smudges of light fade into the long corridor of night. There was a quiet satisfaction in his heart, not triumph, not vanity, but the serene feeling that a circle had been closed. Yet stories rarely end at the first conclusion we give them. They linger, like faint handwriting, beneath the words we later write over them. In Boston, Henry returned to his work designing bridges for the Massachusetts Railway Commission. His colleagues teased him when the story appeared in the Boston Globe under the heading, "A Debt of Conscience Paid in Full." One of them, a young draftsman named Calvin, waved the paper at him one morning and said, "Mr. Forster, I dare say you're the only man in Boston who's ever made the news for 15 cents. He smiled politely. "It's a better reputation than owing $15, I suppose." They all laughed. But beneath the jesting, a few of the younger engineers glanced at him with something like respect. In an age increasingly ruled by contracts, speed, and machinery, there was something quaintly admirable about a man who honored a moral debt from his boyhood. A few days later, one of them placed a silver dime on his desk. He said, "For luck, so that none of us ever forgets what a promise costs." That coin stayed in his pocket for the rest of his life. The years passed quickly after that. The world around him grew louder, faster, more electric. The first automobiles rattled through the Boston streets, scattering horses and thrilling children. Telephones began to ring in parlors. Henry, now in his 40s, watched it all with the quiet astonishment of a man who had been born in the stillness of oil lamps and had lived to see the age of wires and steam. He had no children. His wife, Clara, was gentle and bookish, but frail. Her health declined steadily after 1907, and when she passed away in the winter of 1910, Henry found himself wandering their silent apartment only with the ticking of the mantel clock for company. It was then that he began to read again, truly read, as he had not since boyhood. He revisited the same authors he had known in that first library, Emerson, Thoreau, Whitman. Their voices seemed to follow him across the empty rooms like familiar spirits. One evening, as he sat before the fire, he came upon a passage he had once underlined in his youth. "The measure of a man is the shadow he casts when the sun of integrity is at his highest." He smiled faintly at the thought that his own small shadow, a mere 15-cent story, had somehow stretched across newspapers, classrooms, even sermons. Ministers had quoted it as a parable of repentance. School children had written essays about it. There were, he knew, far greater deeds in the world, but few as innocent. He decided then that when his time came, his library should go to Amherst. He wrote a letter to Miss Whitcombe, still librarian after all those years, and enclosed a modest endowment, not much, only $50, to maintain what he called the integrity shelf. It was to contain works of moral philosophy, essays, and histories that spoke of duty, honesty, and conscience. Eleanor's reply arrived 2 weeks later, written in her meticulous hand. "My dear Mr. Forster, I received your most generous letter and your thoughtful gift. You will be glad to know that the Emerson volume you once borrowed remains safely in its case. It has become, if you'll forgive the phrase, something of a relic. Visitors often stand before it longer than before any of our newer acquisitions. I sometimes think that your 15 cents have earned more admiration than all the grand donations of the wealthy. I shall see that your integrity shelf is established exactly as you wish. It pleases me to think that a book once lost should now be the cornerstone of others found. Yours most sincerely, E. Whitcombe." Henry placed the letter beside the Emerson book on his table. He thought of Amherst, of the maple trees, the quiet streets, the old red brick building. It felt good to know that somewhere in that tranquil town a part of him would remain. By 1912, Miss Eleanor Whitcombe had begun to feel the weight of years herself. Her eyesight dimmed, her once firm handwriting trembled slightly. Still, she refused to retire. "A library," she often said, "is like a living creature. You do not abandon it when it grows old. You nurture it." The trustees allowed her to keep her post on the understanding that young assistants would handle the heavier duties. Every morning she would still polish the glass case containing Henry's letter and the 15 cents. To her, it symbolized something more than moral repayment. It was a rare example of the invisible thread that connected people across time. That spring, a newspaper reporter from Hartford visited to write a retrospective about New England oddities, and Eleanor, in her modest pride, told the story once again. The article, published under the title "The Man Who Paid the Smallest Great Debt," sparked a new wave of public affection. The story traveled to schools, lecture halls, and even the pulpit of a Unitarian church in Boston.
When the clipping reached Henry, he was astonished. "All this for a few coins," he murmured to himself. But he also felt something else, a quiet gratitude that his forgotten moment of honesty continued to light small corners of the world. The following year brought the first tremors of the modern century. In 1914, war erupted in Europe. Though America was still officially neutral, the newspapers overflowed with stories of destruction and honor, duty and debt. Henry read them all with a heavy heart. The world, it seemed, was learning the cost of unpaid obligations on a far grander scale. In September of that year, a letter from Amherst, written in an unfamiliar hand, arrived. It was from a young assistant librarian named Margaret Hale. "Dear Mr. Forster, it is with sorrow that I must inform you that Miss Whitcombe passed away last week after a brief illness. She spoke of you often and asked in her final days that her papers be entrusted to you. Enclosed you will find her last letter. I thought it fitting to send it with my own condolences. Yours respectfully, Margaret Hale, Amherst Town Library." Henry's hands trembled as he unfolded the second envelope. The handwriting, faint but unmistakably hers, read, "My dear Mr. Forster, if this should reach you, then I am already at rest. I wish you to know that your small act of honesty gave me more faith in humanity